Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining for today's talk by Katherine Gibson, who is zooming in from Australia, where it is just after dinner time. Katherine Gibson is at the Institute for Culture and Society at the Western Sydney University, where she is a Professorial Research Fellow. I'll give a little bit of an introduction before Katherine starts her talk. I am at Yates Norton. I am the curator for the public programs at Rupert in Vilnius, and Rupert is a center for art, residencies, and education. First, before I get started, I would like to thank the Lithuanian Council for Culture for supporting all of our activities, and of course, my colleagues at the Rupert's team, Julia, Vitalia, Katrina, Totvidos, Gabriela, Regina, and our interns, Barbara, Anesta, Saule, and Radvila. This talk, Redrawing the Economy, Reclaiming Interdependence, continues our series of online talks that we've been organizing whilst we've been in lockdown. The public programs of which this talk forms a part are this year guided by questions of interdependence and care, particularly from the perspective of disability rights, scholarship, and activism. We have hosted speakers who have all addressed how central interdependence is for social justice work and for artistic practices too. And as I've noted before in introductions to these talks, whilst I've been in lockdown, perhaps it is during this period that our interdependencies with each other, with non-human or more than human beings, the environment, are more apparent than ever. Just to say that the previous talks will be available to watch online, and in the upcoming months there will be more talks and workshops, and we will also continue our reading sessions. And thank you to all those who joined for Sophie Sita's one a few weeks ago. I'm extremely grateful to Katherine for agreeing to speak as part of these programs, not least because her voice has been transformative for me and for countless others. She, together with the late Julie Graham, who wrote together under the pen name J.K. Gibson-Graham, have long been involved in a project of rethinking the economy and of learning ways of being, quote, practically affected by the wide diversity of economic activities that offer possibilities of livelihood and well-being within and beyond the ostensibly global purview of capitalism. They have tirelessly theorized and theorized in the sense of making visible, and have also practically engaged in economic communities where, quote, interdependence is acknowledged and enlarged. Katherine's work has taught us the value of making space for hope, as is just what we were talking about before this, and of being touched and affected by, or in their words, being hospitable to the world and others around us. We are often affected at times of acute emotional stress, and this period is certainly one of them for so many across the world. But these moments can allow us to learn. They can open up possibilities to experiment with other ways of living in the world, and they often make clear our interdependencies. And being affected, as Katherine's work has shown us, allows us to recognize and see the myriad ways we live in a world that is complex and richly differentiated. And crucially, as Katherine's work and J.K. Gibson-Graham's work has shown, it enables us to recognize that systems of oppression aren't totalizing. And this is something that we've discussed throughout in these talks. And Katherine has also taught us the value of imagination as we work together to create other worlds. And in this sense, although we've described Katherine in the bio, which you can see on the Facebook page, as an economic geographer, I think I would also describe her as an artist. Thank you so much, Katherine, for speaking, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rupert. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm calling you Rupert. I should call you Yates. My great uncle was called Rupert, so have a very fond connection to that name. I'd love to know where it came from in your case, but in the case of the institution. Shall I share my screen now with the PowerPoint?
I'm going to mute and stop my video. So.
Okay, thanks, Yates. And okay, wonderful. Well, it's very strange to be talking to my computer, imagining people listening to this talk, but I will try and do so. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. And as we were just discussing, it is a strange way in which the pandemic has forced us into our isolation, but at the same time, we're able to make these wonderful connections across the world. And I certainly am very pleased to be talking to people in Lithuania, which I know very little about, but I would love at some point to visit. So what I'm going to talk about is the work that Julie and I did, and then the work that the Community Economies Collective that we've set up has been doing over many years now to try and take back the economy to some extent as a space of inherent interdependence and recognition of the kind of ethical nature of those interdependencies. And I must start by saying that this year has been an incredible, has had incredible challenges for thinking and living. In Australia, early in the year, we had the most devastating landscape-wide bushfires that tore through all the eastern forests of the East Coast and really have woken many people to questions of our interdependence with other species, with plants, with animals, with soils, with fire. And there's a lot of rethinking going on at the moment around this. And soon after those very devastating fires, of course, we've had the pandemic, which has now, again, placed us in a situation where we're realizing the role of viruses in shaping our lives and building and forcing us to build connections of survival across the world. And in Australia, you know, we're in a very good situation with a very good public health system and a very quick response. So we're not in a very devastating health situation, although there is a bit of a second spike happening at the moment. But this pandemic has definitely forced thought, forced unsettlement in so many ways. And of course, it's brought the economy, so-called economy, to a stop in so many ways. And on top of that, then, of course, the whole eruption of anger and sorrow around the death of George Floyd and so many other people at the hands of police violence in the US has seen the Black Lives Matter movement ratchet up and affect so many people across the US, but across the world, and particularly in Australia, across the Indigenous community and all of us here. So there's been very big, I suppose, challenges to thinking about interdependence in the last few months. And in each case, I think there's been that kind of discussion around these bifurcations where the economy is established as something that needs to be either re-established in its own right, but is always put versus something else called other environment. The case of, you know, we should be kind of managing our forests in Australia because they're an economic resource rather than actually looking after and stewarding our land. So there's this economy versus environment struggle going on. Of course, the whole calculation around opening up the lockdown in Australia and elsewhere is a kind of challenge of economy versus the health of people. And of course, you know, the ways in which racialization has manifested in so many societies has often been, in a way, kind of at the core of economy. And the fact that we can't deal with reparations for past injustices is often put as an economy versus racial justice kind of dichotomy. So there are many ways in which what's challenging us at the moment is also challenging this notion of an economy that somehow should be able to withstand these challenges and jump back and get back, back on in its train and keep going. And I think this is giving us a lot of material to think with. And so I want to maybe, when I go on to talk about the way in which we're thinking of interdependence, I hope that many of you will be thinking about this in relation to some of these major events that are affecting our lives right now. But before I get right into the content of the lecture, I'd like to do something that in Australia we've started to do more generally and more regularly, which is to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from a very specific place. And you'll see in the image behind me the river, the Georges River that I live on in Sydney. And it's basically where that red star is on this map. And I'm living and working on stolen land. This is the land of the three tribes of the Australian Aboriginal nation, the Gadigal people, the Dharawal, and the Darug. And I acknowledge those traditional owners of this land, and I pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future, and emerging. And I acknowledge that this land was never ceded and that I'm living on stolen land. It's very important, I think, for us, and as an aspect of our interdependence with those who have stewarded this land for thousands and thousands of years, to recognise that my privilege is really based upon a very, very sad and violent oppression of Aboriginal people who are still here and have survived many, many years and decades of repression. My own privilege is partly from the fact that one of my ancestors 4 generations ago came to Australia as a convict, a poor person, had been a butcher in London, was destined to be hung for having stolen some items, and was ended up working in this mansion over in the western part of Sydney for a landowner who had taken dispossessed land, but within a generation was able to be freed and become a butcher, and his son became another businessman, and over 3 or 4 generations, I've benefited from the upward social mobility that this person enjoyed by coming to Australia. On the other side of my family, my 3 generations ago, my ancestors came from Scotland and set up one of the first sugar plantations in Queensland, in which Pacific Island slave labour was employed. And you see a picture there of what were called Kanaka labourers from the Pacific Islands working on the sugar plantation that was the basis for my grandfather's ability to then go to university and become a professional doctor. So I feel like the Black Lives Matter movement has really forced me into kind of acknowledging that it's worth stating this kind of interdependence we have, that my white privilege is based upon these realities that aren't that long ago. Here we have a picture of down the south of where I grew up on Gunnamatta Bay, which is an Aboriginal term, in a land and a place where I knew nothing about the Aboriginal heritage, and where it wasn't until very recently I was able to read about this site as a wonderful site of celebration and feasting and so on. I knew there had been an Aboriginal presence, but I had no idea that this was continued unbroken really over many generations. So I think it's important for us in Australia to ground ourselves when we do have public meetings and to acknowledge this. And it's interesting, I think, when we talk to people in Europe and other countries that aren't supposedly settler societies, to think about how they might actually start to do a similar kind of reckoning of their own history and their own privilege or lack thereof. Just lastly, before I start, I did a little bit of research about Lithuania and found out that in the post-war period and after the Second World War, there was a massive attempt to recruit labour to Australia. Of course, white labour was sought after. And in the first shipment after the war of displaced people, a boat came with about 1,800 people. Half of them were from Lithuania, and another quarter were from Latvia. So it's interesting that and of course, the reason they were originally sought out was because they fit the image of white settlers who were seen to be dominant and who were seen to have the rights to occupy this country. So there's a little sort of sense of interdependence with some of you and perhaps some relatives who may have actually come to this country or come to Sydney. But having done that and having said that, and I think that is just one insight into various kinds of responsibilities that recognition of interdependence brings towards us and brings forward. But let me talk now more about our economy project and how interdependence has played a role in the rethinking that Julie and I started to do way back in 1996 and have continued to do in various ways. Our challenge was to kind of rethink the economy as it was defined as an hegemonic capitalist system. And that you can see from the images on the original book that we wrote, the image of Sisyphus rolling a stone up the hill that only came rolling back down on him. And for us, our critique of capitalism was that it was a discourse that could never be thought outside of to some extent, and that this was a problem for people trying to build other worlds, get involved in social justice and so on, that the kind of the way in which capitalism had been thought was to create a system that it was very hard to overthrow. And I kind of like the image that the Turks put onto the translation of our book a number of years later, where we see the capitalist robot, the machine, churning up people and houses and the earth and puffing out the pollution. And Julie and I are there as our little kind of twin Davids, lobbing our slingshots and our stones to try and screw the system up. And to some extent, I guess, we have failed because capitalism seems to be very much still with us. But we do have many strategies, I think, for working towards other worlds despite that. So I guess our initial kind of intervention was to kind of look at the way that the economy had been theorized as a machine that kind of worked with certain kinds of dynamics, and that various people, particularly male economists and policymakers, could pull various levers and make things work again. But of course, what was outside of this were all these things that we know now were always seen as sort of either subservient to the economy, that the environment was there to be used by the economy, health was supposed to fall out of the functioning of the economy, and racial justice, well, if that helped build the economy, it was also going to be something that ultimately somehow economic development would solve. But of course, this is not the case. The more we see this economy machine as dominating our lives and setting up the bottom line, the more these outsides are excluded, and we can't really legitimately kind of get involved in trying to improve well-being and challenge economic and racial and other forms of injustice. So in our view, the way in which the economy was synonymous with capitalism was a problem. And even though, and I guess we wrote this book around the time of the so-called fall of the Soviet Union, and the notion that somehow an alternative and other to capitalism had now dissipated. So the world was capitalist to some extent. Even states that saw themselves as still communist were a form of state-led kind of state capitalism. But the economy then was seen as only these set of practices, wage labour, production of commodities for a market, for private profit, based on private property. And the economy in this format was seen as the most efficient way of having an economy, the most innovative, the most inventive, and based on something called entrepreneurialism, which gave the dynamism to the whole system. And what frustrated Julie and I was the idea that in that vision, the subjecthood, that was available to us as subjects, were these very restricted sets of identities based on notions of rational economic kind of subjectivity and actually, in the sense of what we're talking about, a sense of independence, not interdependence, independence and separation. So one could either be an employee who was agitating for higher wages, one could be a business owner who wanted more and more private profits, one could be a consumer looking for cheaper goods, or a property owner wanting to make capital gains, or an investor, again, wanting to make private returns. Or if you weren't part of that, you were unemployed and you needed to get to be one of these subjects. And I think these are the subject positions, the economic subject positions that were available within this kind of vision of an economy, this capitalist economy. And I still think they are very powerful ideas of economic subjecthood. And of course, they're ones that are being really challenged at the moment as many people are thrown out of work because of the stopping of so many sectors of the economy. But of course, we know that all of us are also many other things that are also producing value, producing care, producing well-being. We can be parents, carers, volunteers, artists, cooperators, self-employed, social entrepreneurs. And our motivations are very different than those that are attributed to that rational economic subject. In effect, we're all many subjects. We're interdependent. We occupy interdependent subjectivities. And I think, of course, it was feminism that really taught us and taught Julie and I the power of thinking through these multiple subject positions. The mauve colouring there is to kind of indicate the impact that feminist economic thinking played in our work. So if there are these many different economic subjectivities, there are many different motivations for being involved in producing goods and services and caring and surviving, then why do we see the economy in a certain light? And so our work has been really to kind of reframe the economy, to use this old classic kind of figure ground shift. Is it a vase? Is it two faces? And we ask, is it a capitalist economy that we're dealing with, or in fact, is it a diverse economy? And in trying to kind of represent the diverse economy, we've often used this image of an iceberg, where what economists focus on as the real economy, employment and wage labour and paid labour, production of commodities and exchange of commodities and capitalist enterprise, is just the tip of an iceberg. And underneath the waterline are all the other, many other kinds of activities, practices, institutions, enterprise types, and so on, that produce well-being and that also maybe undermine well-being. So we've just got a chaotic mesh of activities there showing all the different things that create value, create livelihoods, and interact together to create some kind of well-being. So this image of an iceberg has been very useful and powerful in our work, and it's particularly when we're working in communities where people feel marginalised. They don't feel part of the real economy. They don't see themselves reflected when they listen to the financial news. When we use this idea of a diverse economy iceberg, people start to see themselves as actually playing a role in an economy. And the iceberg has taken many different forms. In working in the Pacific, it became a floating coconut. And here, for many people, many island communities, there's very few paid wage labour jobs. The formal economy is very small, but there's a plethora of activities, informal economic activities, transactions that aren't using cash and so on, in which livelihoods are made and interdependent connections are made between men and women and between community members. So this kind of image, and I guess I'm pointing to the role that different kinds of representations, artistic representations, can play in helping people see themselves in a different light and see the economy as something that they might be able to interact with in a different way. One of the artists who's part of the Community Economy Research Network, Ailey Rutherford, who works in Glasgow, has used the iceberg as in a 3D incarnation in fish shops and others to engage people in communities about what it is that they're involved in, how they make ends meet, and to have those discussions about how do we start to think about economies in different ways. And when in our academic work, I guess we've moved beyond that kind of representation of an iceberg to try and sort of map out all the different ways in which people are engaged in various forms of work or labour, all the different kinds of transactions other than pure market transactions that coexist in our world, all the different kinds of enterprises that exist that may have motivations that are not exactly just about more and more profit, but might have other kinds of motivations like producing cooperative wealth, for instance. All the different kinds of property relations that coexist with pure private property, and all the different forms of finance that and investment that also coexist with the mainstream sector. So this is a kind of inventory, if you like, of diversity. It's an inventory that helps us to see our economy as made up of multiple practices, not all of them nice, not all of them good, not all of them do we want to see perhaps in future worlds, but it's a way of trying to deconstruct the hegemony of one particular image of capitalism that makes it so large that it's hard to think outside of. Okay, so the Diverse Economies Rethinking has produced a lot of interesting work, and just recently I published this book with my colleague Kelly Dombroski, A Handbook of Diverse Economies. So this work has kind of been recognised as a subfield now within, I guess, the social sciences, within geography. And this book has 66 or 58 chapters, I think, by 66 authors who are working in this vein of teasing out all these different aspects of diverse economies. And the cover of the book is an image that comes from Ailey Rutherford's work, working in communities, getting people to map out the kinds of connections and interdependencies and transactions that they have. So a number of years after writing The End of Capitalism and then Postcapitalist Politics, and soon after Julie died, actually, this book, Take Back the Economy, was published, and it had been started. Julie and I had started writing it with Jenny Cameron and Stephen Healy, our colleagues and ex-students, and it was published in 2013. And this was a more of a workbook, more of a popular book to try and talk to people about this thinking and the strategies that one could take to take back the economy, take back work, markets, business, property, and finance. And this book has had an interesting life. It's been translated now into Korean, into Spanish, into Finnish, and there's Greek and China and Mandarin translations in the pipeline. And it's been, I guess, quite useful for people trying to think through what to do once you've done this kind of figure ground shift and started to see diversity. How do we move forward? How do we actually start to act on not the independent rational subject, but our interdependence as economic subjects who are trying to survive well together? So in this book, we kind of reframe then the agenda for work or for labour. I mean, why do we work? We're really working to survive, and how can we survive well? why do we transact? We're really encountering others because we often can't make everything we need to live. We need others to supply those goods and services. And how do we have ethical encounters? We're reframing enterprise as really a way of generating surplus and distributing it, and it can be done in many different ways. And property is really what we make and share and what is the basis upon which we can live, but how do we common it? And lastly, when we invest, we're really we're looking after risk, we're looking after futures. So how do we actually make sure that our investments are creating futures that we all can live in and want to live in? So we tried to kind of shift the focus into what we call the concerns of a community economy. And by community here, I'm really talking about something that we're always building, we're always negotiating, not something that's set or known in advance. So in a community and in a community economy, we might be thinking of different ways of matching together forms of paid labour, forms of reciprocal labour, self-provisioning and so on. And you'll see that I've put a line through some of those activities that I think play no role in a community economy. So these are the kinds of concerns that we've been interested in provoking, but also in documenting, because I think what our research has shown is that there's so many practices out there that are acting upon these kinds of principles of surviving well together and with the earth, of distributing surplus in an equitable sense, in an equitable way, of building encounters with others, again, with taking ethical and responsibility in those encounters. There's a huge interest in commoning at the moment in lots of different spheres. And there's also an interest in how we manage finances and other forms of investment. And consuming sustainably, of course, underpins all these concerns. And these are what we've identified as kind of post-capitalist possibilities, but they're all ethical concerns that build on our inherent interdependence as a kind of world community of humans and more than humans who are, trying to survive well on this planet. And in A Postcapitalist Politics, the book, we talked about the importance of having a different language of economy, identifying these different subject positions, and then in getting involved in different kinds of collective actions to build community economies. And I think it's very interesting to see at the moment in the pandemic, the ways in which so many of these practices of reciprocity and care have been enacted amongst communities that perhaps thought those kinds of practices had, still had no role anymore. People are helping neighbours that they'd never met and this kind of thing. So there's a way in which I think these kind of crises make these practices more visible, but they're also always going on in certain communities, and certainly in diasporic Black communities and others. Methods of mutual financing and mutual aid have always been a part of surviving in oppressive situations. So in Take Back the Economy, the book, we kind of have a whole lot of devices for starting to work together to explore and inventory our own practices, our own kinds of work-life balance, our forms of well-being, our enterprise commitments, our ways of commoning and so on. And I don't have time to go into all those things, but there's a lot of little kind of exercises that you can do by yourself or with others in a group, and could be part of trying to build more ethical and build on an ethical interdependence in a way that's going to and hopefully will reshape economies in various ways. And I guess just to finish on, as many of you are artists and cultural workers, I thought I'd just show you some of the kind of work that's come out of our conversations with people all over the world through Take Back the Economy. Stephen and Jenny and I have done workshops in Korea, in Colombia, and in Finland. And we've also been involved with artists and art practitioners in the UK and in the Netherlands in many different locations. And interestingly, it's been artists who have particularly warmed to our work and have taken it on and are developing it in all sorts of interesting ways, as well as, other people who are kind of other activists in other spheres. And I guess one of the activists that was working on a workshop around the Centre for Plausible Economies in the UK juxtaposed the kind of art that people often imagine of, photographs of nice things. And here she has this cartoon, photographs of the sea, love it, it's so deep. This is the kind of art that often goes on or is put up on the walls of art institutions, as opposed to this kind of image of art, which is all kind of, as I said, what the fuck are we actually doing here? But it's trying to represent some of these key concerns and perhaps think outside of them or move beyond or shift sensibilities. So just to quickly go through some of the work that's come out of engaging with people around redrawing the economy. The iceberg has been an inspiration in lots of different ways. In this work in Korea, the iceberg is really, of course, just a device for showing visibility and invisibility and what's dominant and what's subordinate. And in this case, the group of activists were using different images to portray the activism that they're involved in. And this was Korean activists talking about the media and how mainstream media, they represented as this spiky cactus above the soil line that keeps communities at bay and won't report on what's going on in them. The mobile phone is kind of put in this liminal zone, and then the underground community media area is this kind of network of meshwork of roots that's quite productive, but isn't seen that often. And this kind of image, these images were used in a number of different ways, and different images came forth from that exercise. This was an art kind of expression that community researchers came up with in a deindustrializing region of Australia in an action research project I did many years ago now, where the coal mining region, where a lot of coal-fired power stations were closing down or being privatised, and people had a lot of anger that they wanted to express. And before we could move on to thinking about economies in a different way, we felt the need to express this anger. And this is a kind of a photo essay of how green was my valley, and trying to get out the issue of what has been lost as transition takes place. And we see this kind of exercise of expressing anger is an important first step in trying to move beyond towards different kinds of economy. This is out of an exercise with Colombian activists, again, trying to show the situation they're involved in the international flower industry that takes most of the water of their valley, and again, expressing a sort of the situation as they see it before moving on to thinking about kind of what kind of community economies can be built in this situation, which they then did. This is a wonderful image drawn by Catherine Byrne of an art practice and an economic enterprise, a social enterprise in London, which is called Company Drinks. And you'll see there's the drinks cabinet, which is another image like the iceberg. We have the commercial drinks on the top, and if you open up the cabinet, you have the drinks that have been made by volunteers, by using cultural grants, by donation, by gleaning, and so on. And then she's mapped out all the transactions and connections that are taking place in this community in East London that in the past, as children, many of these old people went with their parents to pick hops in Kent and other places. And now they're doing gleaning in the community and making community drinks, which are then sold, but are also art objects that get displayed at the Victoria and Albert Museum and so on. An interesting kind of art practice that is an economic practice as well as an art practice. And here's a conference or a workshop we held at the Centre for Plausible Economies in the UK, in London, where artists were themselves mapping out their own economies, really, of survival, and trying to, I guess, do that inventory in order to see where was the money flowing, what kind of supports could be built upon, and so on. So just lastly, most recently, a group of us met in northern Italy, again, activists and artists, and we were reflecting on the community economy practices that we're involved in, and we came up with the idea of coining this kind of, what would you call it? I need to come up with a name for it. It's an indicator of interdependent, the IDT. As we're saying here, we're still trying to develop this idea, but an idea that where this logo could be used for all the practices and enterprises and associations that we see or self-identify as building community economies, building ethical economies. So it came up as an idea to replace the Inc. or the LTD that is often associated with corporate values and competition as a kind of way of, an underground way of identifying ourselves, just like copyright or copyleft does, sorry. So we came up with this logo, Interdependent, and call ourselves The Interdependence. And we're trying to launch this as a sort of, I guess, a movement that many artists and art practitioners and community groups and social enterprises and who knows, any kind of economic and ecological enterprise that is based around these values, these ethical concerns, might use as a way of self-identification. So I think I've probably spoken for long enough, and I hope that what I've said was not too fast. I know I was supposed to go much slower, and I'm very sorry, Chuck, for speaking so quickly. I look forward to hearing any questions that you might have and engaging a bit more directly with you as an audience. So I will stop. And anyone that wants to know more about this work could look up the Community Economies website, where a lot of it is documented. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine, for that talk, which was a real education, and also very succinctly and clearly outlined decades of work. So thank you so much for that. I will take the opportunity to ask a question about resistance work, because you have spoken how we can talk capitalism or the economy into being. So I think you had once said that we make it being capitalism or the economy, as much as it makes us. So we can make it into something unified and total and a kind of monolith. But do you think it's sometimes helpful to have these sorts of binaries, we and it, for resistance work? Because could there be ways in which when you smash capitalism into 1,000 pieces, as you said once before, that sometimes it can get overwhelming. So sometimes it can be helpful to have an object against which, a sort of clear defined object against which you resist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, I think this is, many people have a frustration with our work because it does seem to be sidestepping that kind of resistance work. I don't think it does. I think it is important to identify something that you are against, and that could be, oppressive economic relations and so on. The danger is when you see it all kind of lining up all the time, and it then becomes politically kind of demobilizing or debilitating. But I mean, certainly in many situations, you know, in Latin America, for instance, the kind of extractivist agenda of multinational corporations, or in Asia, you know, it's very important to see them as having a set of, I guess, you know, motivations and lack of principles that does see them as something that you want to resist outright. At the same time that I guess I'm interested in then also identifying, for instance, you know, mining companies that one could start to negotiate with a different kind of ethical agenda. So I guess, you know, it's a balancing act between having that outrage and seeing things in their stark reality as so oppressive and so and seemingly connected, and at the same time as doing the kind of deconstructive work that allows you to then figure out what kind of negotiation is going to be possible. Because I think if you just leave it at the kind of resistance, you know, I don't know, I guess I've got a certain pragmatism here where I feel like there's a need to kind of also keep these two things in mind, you know, and but in each context, I think whether one goes towards the resistance politics versus the kind of building community economies politics is going to very much depend on what's possible, what the kind of assemblage of power is in the situation you're working in. And it's not going to be always possible to do the kind of productive constitutive work because of the barriers that are placed in front of people that are going to stop that kind of work. So, but, you know, even, I guess, you know, even in the most, you know, oppressive situations, you can see people trying to work around things too. So I feel like, you know, I kind of keep these two things in mind, and my intellectual work has been largely focused on trying to make the openings more real, more visible, because I inherited a kind of political economic kind of framework and set of theories that were just seeing everything in that kind of everything is always going to be co-opted and coerced, and it became so stifling that I needed to be able to work in another direction. So it's not to say that I don't think those other kind of forms of political resistance aren't necessary. It's just that my own intellectual efforts have been to try and work within those cracks. You know, that's
because I know it's sometimes I feel quite a simplistic critique of so it's really good to have your answer to that, and it resonates a lot with our former speakers as well. David Rubain and Rahila Gupta, who started the program this year, said precisely the same thing, that it's a balancing act of sort of creating the oppression, you know, because as something that you work against, but also being more creative and more open to sort of different possibilities of making things. I also have a question about possible worlds and imagination, and you've written a lot about the idea of creating space to think of possible and other worlds. And I wanted to, so if you could speak a little bit more about the role of imagination in your work, perhaps what you understand imagination to be, and how it has played out in your work.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think, I mean, part of our vision of building other worlds is always predicated on starting where you are. So I guess I would see our form of politics as not kind of, in a way, not utopian in the sense of thinking of something that's totally other and out there and perfect, but working always with these kind of possibilities and cracks that are already here, and starting with them, but moving beyond, I guess, they're, working with them in some ways. So, yeah, it's a very, I think, you know, the issue of kind of inhabiting other kind of subject positions that other than the victim or the oppressed subject position, ones where that sense of possibility and creativity can be unleashed, is very important, because it's that, and that's where I feel the imagination can come in, to thinking about what other kinds of connections and ways of living can we imagine. And, you know, in some ways I'd love to see this happening right now, where, you know, we're confronting a world that there's a lot of possibility at the moment for shifts. You know, in Australia, we've just heard that our national airline is laying off most of its workers. And, you know, the international airline industry is kind of at a halt, but everyone's mourning that. But at some level, we know that, you know, cutting down on international travel is going to help with our ozone, help with our greenhouse gases, with the kind of future of dealing with climate change issues, etc. Can we imagine a world in which there's much less international travel through planes and so on? And what would that be? And how can we imagine that as not a lack? Because at the moment, it's all being presented to us as, oh, we can't, you know, we can't consume as like we used to. We can't do all these things. It's as if it's a lack, rather than as if it's not an opportunity for us to think about a different way of having a world that actually might start to repair itself, you know? So I guess but I don't know how would I get other people on side with me about that, you know? So, you know, I feel like my imagination is almost perverse. It's a form of going against the grain rather than going with the grain. And whether that, it's a challenge in a way. I don't think it's easy to have an imagination. It's sort of, but it's a way in which I think something that Julie and I we goaded each other to try and think these difficult things and think around them, even if they weren't, they're not mainstream. But and can we feel excited about a world in which we won't travel as much? I don't know. You know, I'd love to hear from people about that. But it does seem like there's so many things that are happening at the moment that could be shifted into a different register for building a different kind of world. But at the moment, everything is, if we can't bounce back, it's going to be terrible. Well, why can't we bounce to a different forward, you know? Sort of, that's the kind of imagination I'd love to see ignited in people, you know? And it's not, and it shouldn't be a small imagination, and it shouldn't be nationalist or, falling back into this kind of horrible, you know, America first or Australia first or that nationalist kind of thing. How do we actually have a different kind of global imagination that builds on some of the possibilities that are now confronting us, you know? It's a very long-winded and probably unfocused answer, but it's a provocation.
No, that was really brilliant to hear. And I have a question from Inessa Pavlovskaita, who's a curator based between Lithuania and New York. And she thanks so much for your talk. Do you see any danger of capitalism with the capital C co-opting the IDT, and grassroots organizations, etc.? So co-opting their strategies. So I never know how to pronounce it. Chiapello and Boltanski, for example, wrote about it with regard to the 1968 movement and capitalism taking over artistic strategies of self-organizing. But I am also thinking of the knowledge sharing economy, which is being capitalized more and more today.
Yes, well, you know, there's always the danger of co-option, I think. And I don't think there's any perfect answer to this. I haven't got a crystal ball. I think anything that's innovative could be co-opted and will be co-opted. And it's up to us to be vigilant to some extent and to develop ways of analysing and negotiating and having nuance around whether something has been co-opted and shifted to into a different power geometry or not. And I mean, the knowledge economy and, the kind of, the way in which culture has been taken on, cultural industries and so on, taken over as the boosterist way of developing, deindustrialized towns or whatever. There's so many ways in which one can see these things as being co-opted into a kind of a profit agenda. And there's, again, and then there's the ways in which people have fought to keep these kinds of practices cooperative and reciprocated, and tried to develop different kinds of laws that will ensure that they don't get taken over by corporate interests and so on. So this is a struggle. The co-option is, the potential for co-option is the kind of daily struggle of trying to build a community and build community economies. I don't think it's a reason to stop doing that, with the fear that something will be co-opted is not a reason to not come up with new and creative ways of doing things. It's just the, it's always there. It's, and so, yeah, I guess that's my answer. I mean, every possibility can be co-opted, and every possibility can be kind of defended for a different kind of, in a different ethical framing. And, one can, I don't think you can prevent one or the other, but you can also develop collective analytical skills to kind of sort of triggers to figure out when it's being used in a one way or not. And how to protect the IDT, I don't know. I mean, that would be something interesting for us to think through, and to what extent we want to kind of control its use or put it out there so anyone can use it is a question that we're still kind of debating. Maybe it would have a performative effect if we did that anyway. So, yeah.
And you spoke about innovation, and you have also written about repair. And so innovation is a word that I think is so much associated with kind of technological innovation and also making money. I actually remember I was telling you, Katherine, when we were reading your work in Italy, and then the PowerPoint went on sleep mode, and the company tagline was empowered by innovation. and I thought,
is it an energy company?
Yeah, and I thought how different that was from a way of thinking that is based on repair and care work. And I just wondered, I wanted to hear a little bit more about your relationship to innovation and repair.
Yes, well, I guess we've engaged quite a bit with the kind of social innovation literature, where it's taken, the terms being kind of taken away from the design and the technical side of things to talk about innovative ways of relating and, social innovation around, creating ways of producing well-being and so on. So I haven't got a resistance to the term because I'm using it, I'm kind of trying to reframe it for other kind of uses. And in that vein, I think, the idea of repair and reparation and stewardship and so on is very important, and in fact is a site of incredible social and technical innovation at the moment. I've just finished a project on manufacturing in Australia with Jenny and Stephen and Joe McNeil, and some of the enterprises we've been working with are social enterprises that are all in that kind of recycling and repair kind of area, which is an incredible kind of growth area to some extent, taking apart mattresses rather than seeing them dumped on the side of the river, and taking all the constituent parts and making them into other things, but in the process employing a lot of people who are at distance from the labour market or have come out of prison or are Indigenous, and creating employment for people in a sphere that is producing an environmental good, but also extending the life of materials and so on. So there was a number of enterprises as part of our study that were very much in this space of using business in a very different way, both within that kind of ecological framework of making a more sustainable sort of manufacturing sector, but also really engaging with economic justice and social inclusion. So, it's I think there is scope for commandeering that term, taking it out of the business school or certain areas of the business school and into other spheres where it can be linked definitely to care and repair and these other kinds of relations between people and between materials that really should be, a core to what our economies are about at the moment and going into the future. Yeah.
Mm. I think we have time for one question also to give Chuck a break. Thank you, Chuck. So from Ed Carroll, is there any connection between IDT? You've got to copyright this IDT. And the black market, not the illegal activities, but those self-help and do it together, so like DIY activities for communities that are counted OECD as the black economic activities. So I think the question is the relationship between IDT and those aspects which characterize the black market, like DIY and
Yes, and that really is just a way of another name for what often has been called the informal economy, or the kind of unregulated, untaxed economy necessary. And I guess it's something that probably needs to be challenged, the actual using of that term to denote basically that, unregulated and so on, and often denigrated and seen as illegal to some extent, whereas it isn't. So I think what's been called, what is in that unregulated, untaxed, informal kind of sector is often all these forms of, whether it's mutual help or self-employment and so on. And if those things are building on interdependence and creating those kind of meshworks of support, then I would see them as, yes, being able to have the IDT designator, But it's it's a fine line, because there obviously are various illegal activities that are quite oppressive that are taking place also in that sector, that are ones that one would not want to identify with in any way, shape or form, even though they're supporting certain communities, whether it's a mafia enterprise or whatever, there's, but the sort of, I guess we need to think about what are the criteria here, and the criteria is to kind of create more support for livelihoods in a kind of equitable and sustainable way, and not an oppressive way. So, yeah.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on, and thank you, Katherine, for presenting your work. And I know so many of us are looking forward to reading more about your work and also getting involved with your work too, because I know that you've brought together theorizing and activism and practical work and imagination so brilliantly in a way that's very inspiring. So thanks very much. And to let our listeners know that subject to no technical difficulties, and also to Katherine's permission, the video will be available on our website to watch later. Thanks very much. And
thank you very much, Yates, and thanks, Chuck, for doing your magic.